Today we're taking a look at how I mic up a guitar cab as well as some post EQ to kind of smooth things out and really bring out the best in each amp. There are loads of different ways to mic up guitar cabs, and this is just one of those ways. So if you get the chance, definitely experiment with different mics, mic placement, or combinations of mics, and you might come across something cool. So having said that, let's get into it. For this video and the majority of the demos on my channel, I'm using a combination of a Shure SM57 and a Neumann TLM-102 large diaphragm condenser mic. The Shure is really laying the groundwork and the base of the tone, and the TLM is adding a bit of additional body and low end. There's a few things to try to keep in mind here. First, I think it's important to try to get a decent sound with one single mic before you go getting into the world of blending multiple mics together. Once you have two microphones on the same source, you're really opening the door to a world of phase issues, but we'll get into that a bit more later. Generally speaking, the closer to the center of the speaker you have your mic placed, the brighter the sound is going to be, and vice versa. I like to start with a 57 right on the edge of where the dust cap of the speaker meets the speaker cone itself, at around an inch or so away from the grill cloth. This is pretty standard for rock and metal tones, so here's what a 57 sounds like on its own. So that sounds pretty cool, but when I'm playing the amp in the room, I'm hearing a little bit of a fatter sound. This is where the second mic comes in to fill out the sound a little bit. A Shure 57 is the industry standard as far as guitar cab mics, but the TLM is sort of a happy accident that I stumbled on. Originally, I bought it as a relatively inexpensive vocal mic, but I gave it a shot on my cab and it actually sounds pretty cool. If I were buying a mic specifically to pair with a 57, I'd probably opt for a Royer 121, an SE ribbon mic, a Bayer Dynamic M160, a Sennheiser 421, but this TLM is what I got, so I'm rolling with it for the time being. So back to that phase issue we talked about before. In order for two microphones to be in phase or phase aligned, the sound from your source needs to hit the microphone at exactly the same time. You'll know if your phase is off if your recorded tone sounds kind of hollow or something like this. So you can actually see in the recorded waveform from your two mics if the signals are in phase or not. Essentially, you want to see the peaks and the valleys be lined up with one another in both of your sources. And when they are, and things sound properly in phase like this, then you know you're doing all right. But what I'll do here is I'll actually nudge the TLM mic a little bit off, which essentially is mimicking if I had pulled the mic back maybe an extra inch or so away from the cab. It's a pretty easy fix by adjusting your mic placement either closer or further away from your source to compensate. You can also correct phase in your DAW by slightly nudging the offending track either earlier or later to compensate, but you can see how important getting your phase correct is. So now that I've got my mics in a good spot that I'm happy with, I'm hearing some extra frequencies being picked up by the mics that aren't as apparent to my ears in the room. That's probably because when we're playing guitar, our ears aren't slammed right up against the grill cloth the way that a microphone is. The sound from the speakers is being reflected and diffused throughout the room, so what I'm gonna do is apply some EQ in post on my recorded tracks to make things sound a little bit closer to what I'm hearing in the room. So down here on the bottom left at my mixer, you can see that I've got my SM57 and my TLM 102 track. So both microphones are being grouped together into a single guitar bus where I can apply EQ and things like that, kind of treating it like it's just one mic, even though it's these two combined. And the first thing that I have on this guitar bus is actually an EQ. And when doing these amp demos, I really try to stay true to the sound of the amp and not, overly EQ anything to change the natural characteristic of an amp. But I've been pretty consistent about how I do this throughout all of these videos. So even if that were the case, it's kind of the same to all of them. So I'll play an example with the EQ turned off to start with. So to me, I hear a little bit of additional brash, kind of brittle top end that doesn't really need to be there, as well as a bunch of extra low end that you probably won't hear unless you have a pretty gnarly subwoofer in your system. So that was kind of a quick look at how I have things EQ'd in this particular scenario. Basically, I'm just rolling off a bunch of low end and rolling off that kind of brash, brittle top end. One thing to note with this notched out frequency here, when you're recording distorted guitars, it's really common for frequencies between kind of 2K and 4K to build up in that area, and you'll hear these kind of harsh whistling frequencies that sound like this. And you can kind of hunt around and find a bunch of them. With time and experience, you'll hear the problematic frequencies that tend to stand out. You can definitely go overboard and remove too much content here, which kind of neuters your guitar tone. To me, it's the frequencies that remain static regardless of which notes you're playing on the guitar. In a full band mix, these are typically not as noticeable, but it's worth noting. So the next thing up in the chain is actually another little bit of EQ. I'm using a Schoeps 1073 EQ. All that I'm really doing is adding a tiny bit of top end here. I'm boosting like a dB at 12K. Like I had said before, when you roll off the high end like that, it's great to get rid of that brittle brashness, but sometimes you lose a little bit of that cool, kind of slicey, cutting top end. So again, I'll play the same riff with and without that 1073 EQ. So it's not really a world of difference there, but it's really just in an effort to bring back a little bit of that high end that was lost when we rolled off the top end here. I think adding this after you've rolled off the top end just brings that back to how I'm hearing it in the room. So next up in the chain, I'm adding a bit of reverb to our guitar sound that we have. And I'm doing that in a way that I use all the time when I'm actually mixing a song. And what I'm doing is I'm sending this signal to a reverb bus. So I'm sending our joined guitar tracks from this guitar bus into a separate reverb bus. And on that reverb bus, I have a Waves reverb plugin, and it's set to 100% wet. So when you listen to it, all you're gonna hear is the actual reverb signal, and it sounds like this. So what's cool about doing it this way is I actually have reverb on its own fader, so I can blend it in to taste. We'll start with it off. And we'll check out the same thing, but with a distorted sound. So in the interest of being thorough, right after that reverb on the reverb bus, I'm just getting rid of that additional low end and top end. Low end can build up really easily, so it's just a kind of good practice to get rid of the frequencies that you don't really need there. So here's the reverb bus without the EQ. And then adding the EQ. So coming to the master bus here, we've only got 2 plugins and they're not doing a whole hell of a lot to adjust the way that things are actually sounding. First up, I've got a plugin called Soothe, and all that it's really doing is kind of taming a tiny bit of additional harsh frequency. If you're recording a lot of distorted guitars, it's really easy for high-end harshness to kind of build up, and this helps mitigate that just a little bit. So that's what this plugin is actually removing here. So it's a super subtle difference. You might not even hear a difference there, but I've kind of just gotten in the habit of throwing it on there to just clean up the top end a little bit, anything that I might have missed. And lastly, I've just got a limiter on there to bring up the overall volume of the track and get it ready to upload online. I'll play it with and without it. It's just going to sound louder. So those little red areas that you saw, that's where the limiter is actually limiting or compressing to a very high ratio the audio that's passing through it. So that's the full signal chain of how I've recorded these demos and how I generally mic up a guitar cab. There's just a few things to note. Sometimes guitar tones that sound great on their own don't really work all that well in a mix. When I'm recording guitars for a full song, I'll often end up shaving off way more low end than what you're hearing in these examples, but I feel like that low end is nice when you're listening to a soloed demo and it sounds a little bit closer to what you'd hear standing in the room with the amp. 57 on its own can often be a little hard or harsh sounding when you listen to it in this soloed context, but if you're mixing a song more often than not, a 57 on its own works just fine and gets the job done. So again, that's probably where I would start before you go into the world of mixing mics and things like that, but it's definitely cool for these kind of demos. So that about wraps it up, at least for how I go about recording amps, but we've only really scratched the surface of miking and mixing techniques. I don't claim to be a master of this stuff, but I really enjoy doing it, and I'm always trying to learn things along the way, so I hope this has been helpful to you in some way. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to get to them in the comments. I really appreciate you checking out the video, and we'll see you next time. Take care.